Therefore, after he had gone out from them, that's referring to Judas, Jesus said this. It says right here that Jesus said, now, okay, that's going to be very specific. Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. All right? I'm just going to stop right there, and I want to get a little bit of detail here. Right here we have that Judas had just went out from them, and the second he exits the door, that's when Jesus suddenly stands up. When finally it has been weeded down to the true group, and the one has gone. And the one who has gone is the one who's actually going to be the triggering mechanism. Who in here saw The Passion of the Christ that was done by Mel Gibson? Right? The Passion of the Christ, I guess they're going to do a sequel to it. Obviously, the resurrection probably warrants a lot of attention. In The Passion of the Christ, it was supposed to cover what we would consider specifically the sufferings of Jesus for the sins of the world specifically. And the movie starts in the Garden of Gethsemane. I would argue that The Passion of the Christ starts right there when Jesus says, now the Son of Man is glorified. Why? Because that's the first moment. The betrayal by the friend is the beginning of the pain. But I want you to be able to see the big picture, and we live in a world where so few see the big picture. The big picture is something like this. To see the glory of God is a great thing. The greatest thing, and Jesus is specifically saying, the greatest work that God has ever done is fixing to be performed on the face of the earth. Now that's a big statement, because the Son of Man is the one who it was all leading up to. All starting back there in Genesis 3:15 when it talked about that prophecy of the seed of the woman would be the one who would have the heel struck, right? The heel bruised as he's striking the head of the serpent. All right? That's where all of those promises began. And it would all be leading to him. This is the moment. Now, the scriptures are very interesting in that when Jesus talked about him being glorified, normally up to this point, it had always been that he was glorified, specifically, if we want to get detailed in theology, he was glorified through his miraculous works. You know, I was talking the works that I do and stuff. These are the things that are showing the glory of who he really is and the glory of God. And all of a sudden, he turns to this. And many people will say he's talking about the resurrection. No. He's talking about his suffering. Now think about that. Out of all the miraculous works of God that you have seen in the scriptures, and there are earth-shattering miraculous events that have happened on this planet by the hand of God. And now Jesus Christ says that the greatest work God will ever do will show you on this day that they're entering into is his suffering. That is the opposite of everything that we reconcile as glory in this world. Often in the church, we even preach the opposite of that. I've heard it pour out from the pulpits that it's something other than this. But even Paul understood it when he said that I might know him in the fellowship of his sufferings. But that's where the strength from the Christian comes in. You know that the greatest glory, this is what once I believe made this country great. Everybody talks about what had made this country great. This country, in some ways, was the end result of centuries of the development of Western civilization, some good, some bad, some from Jewish culture, some from Greek culture, some from Roman culture, but a whole lot from biblical culture. And what we used to understand in this nation was this, that there is a glory in suffering. There is something to be had. There's something great to endure by virtue of the motivation of love for something greater. how many soldiers throughout the centuries who were raised up by Christian moms and grandmas slapped in a clip into that M16. Something echoing around in their head when it was getting hot and heavy. Something like, no greater love has any man than that he would lay down his life. In that moment, it probably doesn't even coalesce to the exact words of the scriptures, but they know something like that is in there. And it said, charge. And that's being lost in America. Now we think glory is appetite. We think that glory is indulgence. The power and the ability to indulge. You know, the power and ability to see how many can jump through your hoops. How many people you push in certain directions by throwing your weight around. That is what we're coming to. There's no more of this greatness. Everything great and glorious is something that truly would be extracted from the story of Jesus Christ. Think of the glorious courage of the Scriptures. Let's just go through and see a cast of characters a little bit. Let's go back really far. Let's go back to some of the greats. Let's look at Abraham. There were moments that Abraham had to face. Abraham had his nephew Lot taken captive in a great war. And Abraham had never led an army, but he was a powerful, wealthy man. And there came that night when he finally had to decide, I will not let Lot die. And overnight, he raises up a great army. And he goes and he wipes out entire armies. Obviously, he's a friend of God to be able to pull this off. And he brings back his own flesh and blood. But there were moments that had to be horrifying. Can I do this? But he was willing to do this. There were great things when he's an old man. And that child taken up onto Mount Moriah. And it looks like it's going to be the death of all of his dreams right there in front of him. And obviously he has the same mindset of Jesus Christ when it says, not my will, but your will be done. And he raises the knife. Somehow, and it says later in the New Testament, he believed somehow, I don't think he had it all theologically hammered out, somehow God would raise his son from the dead. He believed in the resurrection. But imagine the pain of that moment. What about the night before when he knows what he's got to do and there's that moment as the sun rises and he thinks, I'm going to kill my son today. All of these things that have gone on. The wrenching suffering that has already gone on throughout the great people of faith, throughout the Scriptures. These aren't just words that float out that are become part of our culture. These are people who lived lives. Let's look back at that. Let's look at Moses. There was that moment when his mother finally had to let him go into the Nile. She had to just believe somehow he's going to live. I don't know how. These were people who lived these lives. Moses named his first son Gershom, if I remember. I think that might be it. All I know is that Moses' first son, his name literally means stranger in a strange land. He was once a great person. Even in, I believe it's recorded in the histories of Josephus that it was believed that Moses actually at one time had fought massive wars. Back when he was still on the side of the Egyptians, that he had fought wars and subdued all of Egypt's enemies around them. And then he's nothing. He kills a man. And then he goes off and he knows that he's such a has-been. And he's out away. Now he's no longer among either of his family. He's not among the Egyptians. He's not among the Hebrews. He's among like Midianites and stuff like this. And he says, my son. And the way he feels at that time is, I'm a stranger in a strange land. And then there's that night that he knows the next day, I'm going into the courts of Pharaoh. I don't know what's going to happen. There's that moment where you have to face the darkness. Will God come through? When I drop that staff, or really when I tell my brother to drop that staff, is that staff just going to stay a staff? There's that moment where you just have to walk in the darkness. All these men. How about the moment that the great David in child form, that moment when he has to walk down. So there comes moments when nobody else is going to do it. There are great heroes of the faith, and what they did was great. And so David, that moment where he steps first foot into that valley, and there was a man like nothing you have ever seen standing before him, who was the greatest warrior of his day, who by all reasonable accounts is going to kill David. And his brothers don't go with him. His family don't go with them. And later he writes about it, though I walk the valley of the shadow of death. He's just a kid. But he's a hero. He's a great man. And then he kills that giant, and he takes his head off his shoulders, so that the world may know the enemies of God will not always stand forever. And we learn that lesson from David. And then we go on and we see Jeremiah down in the pit. What was he thinking down there? Maybe, my God, why hast thou abandoned me? Maybe he may have even said the same possible words that David did and Jesus did. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. I'm forgotten. I served him. There were all these great things. But there were these moments. What about the moment when Daniel, maybe that morning prayer, and he thinks this is it. Today's the day. I'm going to be eaten by lions today. These are children's stories that we've become very used to. But he doesn't know how this is going to go down. Or how about that moment when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they know that when that music is done playing, that they've got to bow the knee. They've got to do it. But they've already discussed it among themselves. They know, guys, we're dying together today. What about the night before? Samson. He knew he was going to be taken probably into the temple of Dagon. He probably knew what he had planned. He may have even really had the faith to believe that God will return his strength. But then he's got to face it alone. He goes into the temple of Dagon, surrounded by the filth, laughing at him. He was once a great power, lifting the doors off the gates, destroying armies with the jawbone of a donkey. People just don't do that. In that moment, one, if God does grant him the power, he knows what he's going to do. He's going to kill them all. He will save his people from the oppression, but he's going to die with them. And this one says, remember me. This is the kind of night that they've all had leading up. How about Esther? Let's throw in a woman there of great faith. That moment before she walks through the doors to see the king. And the law in that land is, if he does not hold out that scepter to you, you deserve the death penalty. You deserve the death penalty. But it's the only game in town. Nobody else can do it. All the Jews will die. Every single Jew in captivity is going to die. The Savior motif over and over and over and over, leading up to one. Even in the form of a woman, Esther, that she doesn't know. Is his heart still with her? There had been trouble. There had been distance between her and the king for some time. Is it still there? Do you realize that the Jewish people on that day were saved by the love between one man and one woman? It came down to just that. That's how thin it was. That a man actually loved his wife. The Jews almost got wiped out if he didn't love his wife that day. That motif continues. And that is the conditions in which now all of this suffering leads up to Christ. Right? There had been great deliverances through great suffering all through these ages. And then it's when Christ says this, now the Son of Man is glorified. And God will glorify him. If God is glorified him, God will glorify him in him. I was never quite sure, and I think I understand this passage now. His great work that will glorify him, that will show you who he is, what he's made of. Who is Jesus really? What is the stuff that he is made of? Is this. Is that he is going to fight that day to secure eternal righteousness and salvation for a nation, a world of people who are doomed. That is what he's going to do. He is going to endure a day, a whole day this man goes through, hours and hours. It's not like this. It's hours. And he will save the whole world. Jesus will save everyone that day. All who would believe, and it could be offered to anyone. But they can't see the big picture. And because of the greatness of the suffering of Christ that he would endure for you, this cannot be lost in modern America, in our Christianity. It's not, there's a lot behind saying Jesus died for you. A lot behind that. Jesus kept himself upon that cross because he loved you. You were fixing to see the greatest display of the love of God that had ever been shown since time immemorial. The wrath of the world and the wrath of God would all singularly coalesce on the shoulders of one completely innocent man. He would endure that. And Son of Man in that day, there would be one of us. It's not just God, it's the God-man. God-man. He was representing us. He was fighting for us that day. He was our David that day to face the Goliath that none of us could overcome. One of the reasons David was chosen to go down there to face Goliath was this. He is the only one who can. It may not look like it, but he's the only one who can defeat the Goliath. God sent the power of that flying stone through one vessel, and that was David. No one else could do it. That's why he walked down there alone. And there comes a day when you can't do it. Your strength dries up, and there's only one left who can do it. And all the hope of the world rests upon these next couple of hours with this one man. Can he do it? Can he endure it? Will he do this? Mankind, all in one man, the new Adam. All of civilization represented in this one man as our champion. Can he win us back our relationship with God and bring us out from underneath the curse? It all falls to this one man. And then it says, and if God is glorified in him, God will glorify him. And over there in Revelation 3, we see that the day comes when people start to weep, when no one can open up the seal of the book because no one's worthy. There's not a single human that can open up the seal to that book. And then one steps forward. I can open it. He doesn't just open up that seal, he opens up the door because he is the door. There is no other game in town but Jesus Christ. The only way you're making it back is Jesus. And if he couldn't have done it, that's it. We're doomed. We could make up 1,000,000 religions and it wouldn't matter. Nobody comes back if one hasn't come back. And so we see in there over in Revelation, guess who is worthy not just to open up the seals, who is worthy to sit on the throne of eternity. The same throne where the prophets saw a great person sitting on a sea of glass back in the old days. And they called him the Ancient of Days. No man could ever sit on that throne. Are you kidding? A man sit on the throne of God? Things can't be that way, but they can. There is one man who can step forward and sit on God's throne. Not just the throne of David, on God's throne. Do you know how big that is? To sit on the throne of creation, to sit on the throne of eternity, the heaven that is so high that God even stoops down to look into the things of heaven, that highest heaven. Jesus sat down right there, and God graciously accepted him sitting right there. Why? Because he's his son. Humanity in that moment was able to sit. Now, you're not divine, you're not God, but one of us was able to sit all the way to the very top. To the very top. A man sat and still sits on the throne of God. I'd say that's higher than all kinds of things that we might count as glory. This is what's important about this, is you've got to know when you're willing to face the final hour of this world and destruction and suffering, no matter how bad it might get. You've got to stand. God will not forget you. That no matter how bad it gets now, that you can sit in the glory of glories with Jesus Christ